Welcome to the next 90 minutes. I'm Ronan Harrington, and I'm joined here with Gail Bradbrook, and we're going to be basically asking this very big and often difficult to answer question about consciousness, and in particular, is coronavirus shifting consciousness? And I imagine that everyone here has some kind of stake in that question, or they have some very deep, that question means a lot to them. I imagine that everyone here is on some developmental journey or on some journey of consciousness and wishes that for the world. And so our intention tonight, before everyone came on the call, we said a prayer together, and our intention is really to give ourselves the permission to ask this question and receive any wisdom that might be within and between us. And so the format tonight is that it's basically an interactive talk. So I'll open for about 10 minutes with just some context about this question. What does it mean to shift consciousness? How might consciousness be shifting in this moment? And then we'll pass it to Gail, and she's going to share her thoughts for about 15 minutes, and I might pick up some threads. And then we want to turn it over to you. And we're aware that often in these formats, we can be kind of perpetuating this kind of cult of guru and this person who is an expert. And I think everyone on this call is living through this moment and has a ton of wisdom and insight. And we want to be able to try and harness that as best we can. And so there'll be a space for comments and questions. And hopefully in 90 minutes time, we'll be able to walk out of here with just a greater maybe sensitivity to what is going on in this moment, and hopefully more of a depth of understanding. So to begin, I just invite us just to actually pause and to ground. So if you feel comfortable, you can close your eyes and just put your feet on the floor. You can bunch up your shoulders just to release the day. And I'll just invite you just to breathe in and just let out a sigh. And we'll just breathe in together again. Yeah, so takes a long time for us to land in these calls. So really just inviting you just to take your time and just to do what you need to feel present here. And now if you haven't done already, if you're on gallery view, you're probably seeing lots of faces and lots of boxes. And I just invite you just to take a moment, just to really look at who is in the room with you. So just taking a second look again through these boxes and just seeing who are the humans that turn up to a talk on how the coronavirus is shifting consciousness. You can also go in a bit closer just so you can get a look at these people in the room. Just check them out. You can also give them a wave as well. If you just want to give them a little wave, a little hello. Yeah, here we are together. And there's like 3 pages of humans. So when you make it onto the next page, you can also give the next page a wave. And if you see if you see a friendly face, if you see someone you know, you're more than welcome to like flirt with them over private chat. But know that as the host, I have access to that chat, so you have to keep it somewhat above board. So yeah, I just really want to warmly welcome all of you, and I really hope that you feel comfortable and that and that you feel like this is also your space. It's not just a space to hear from Gail and I, it's a space for all of us to share our ideas as best we can with 65 people. Okay, good. Well, that's as settled as I think I can make everyone. I feel a little more settled myself, which is good. Okay, so yeah, just a little bit about me. Basically, for the last 10 years, I have been exploring this intersection between what I call developmental culture and systems change. For a long time, you know, politics has been this maintenance of the status quo, but there's been this systems change agenda, or this desire for a radically different or new society. And then I think in the last couple of years in particular, there's really been this integration of, we need some degree of personal transformation for the world to be different. And for the past, I say 5 years, I've been searching for basically ways in which that is manifesting. I think when Russell Brand, you know, said to Jeremy Paxson a couple of years ago, he's not voting because what we need is a spiritual revolution, and had 10 million views on YouTube, that kind of ignited something in me. And I created a network called Alter Ego, which is to bring together leaders who were actually had the bravery to ask, how do we bring together spirituality and politics? There's a great quote from Charles Pegway: everything starts in mysticism and ends in politics. And it's, how do we actually unite these two poles together? How do we actually really go into the mystical territory and receive the wisdom and the potential that is there for us, but follow it all the way through into that slow task of remaking the world? And on that journey, I had the pleasure of coming across Gail. Gail and I met for the first time in a San Pedro ceremony for activists who were trying to bring together these two worlds, and we were actually sat down beside each other, which I trust in the serendipity of that. You know, who you're placed beside, why you're placed beside them. I think at one point I was purging on behalf of Gail, so there was definitely like a cosmic connection. And I remember at the beginning of, at the end of the ceremony, we were all kind of like really fired up, and we had kind of come into a deeper alignment. And this is about a year before April 2019. So Extinction Rebellion was still a kind of a seed of an idea in Gail and the other people in Stroud's mind. And Gail said, look, like, fuck this shit. We need a full-on rebellion. I'm organizing it. Who's in? And you could feel this kind of like, this like kind of ghostly silence of like, I don't know what to make of this person. And I definitely had that feeling of like, yeah, whatever. And it was incredible in a year's time to watch Gail on the back of a truck in Marble Arch, having done a 2-week rebellion, and put climate emergency on the agenda, and actually create, turn an unreasonable idea into a global movement. And not long after, I joined in the political circle to contribute to thinking through, you know, what is the strategy of Extinction Rebellion. And I think by the time of the October Rebellion, the last major rebellion, I think that you know, Extinction Rebellion had succeeded in bringing awareness to climate emergency and turning it from the sustainability challenge into an emergency. It has succeeded in the framing. But there was a deeper unanswered question, which it still is: how do you take the public on a journey from awareness to commitment, and from commitment to self-sacrifice? What is that journey? And I think many of us have an instinct that that journey is intertwined with what we might call some kind of shift in consciousness, or a personal transformation, or a journey of transformation. And so what was really interesting was, in the thinking behind the October Rebellion, there was a real desire to shift the narrative from away from CO2 in the atmosphere to near-term vulnerability. It was moving it away from the kind of the metrics of climate emergency to supermarket shelves, to wildfires, and to really give people this visceral experience through movement organizing, that we were in deep trouble. So if you just joined, if you can mute your mic, that would be really good. So Taryn, if you can mute your mic, that would be great. And I think that it was a narrative that was moving more and more from this kind of green politics to, you and your loved ones aren't safe. And until you clock that we're in danger, we won't be able to shift. And if I think about like what like a blue sky complete dream would be at that time, it would be something like, imagine if you could press pause on the capitalist merry-go-round. Just for one day, you could press pause, and we would just stop, and we would breathe, and almost trusting that the wisdom of that silence and that pause would do more than decades of campaigning. And of course, we could never anticipate it at the time that, you know, 6 months, even less later, a virus would come along and would do that. and it would upend decades of economic thinking. It would make policies that were deemed radical and crazy completely accessible in the moment. And it would bring people head on with a collision with their own mortality, with the mortality of the people that they love the most, and bring about a huge. And so this is the cauldron that all of us are in at the moment. And I want to take it out of the abstract for a moment, because it's not just this us putting on our hats and doing some collective analysis. It's also, you know, people on this Zoom call have probably lost grandparents and potentially parents. And it's important just to acknowledge that all of us are living through a really scary, crazy moment, and that this call is also holding that, and it's also trusting that there is wisdom in that. This isn't just like an intellectual exercise of scenario planning and looking at where the world is going. This is almost, I think, getting on some level that what is happening to us, as unbearable as it can be, is also shifting us and changing us in ways that can be of service to the world. And I think that's what we want to explore today on that call, is that kind of deeper shift that's happening in society. I think that I personally sit with this real longing for this shift in consciousness and this hope for transformation, and also this kind of this quite like this sober realism that this group that is assembled here tonight are actually part of quite a small niche, a very privileged niche that have not only had economic opportunities, often, not in every case, but also developmental opportunities. And so it's very easy for us to say, oh, this is going to create a shift in consciousness, when for a huge other population, it could mean, you know, long-term economic redundancy, or it could mean global hunger. And so I'm always interested in obviously holding our own hopes for the world, and also taking off our particular developmental standpoint or ideological standpoint, and trying to empathize with what this experience might be like for someone who votes Conservative from the Midlands, someone who is homeless in Detroit, someone who is in a farm in India, and how we can, with those hats on, and as best we can, this empathy with how they see the world, how this might be shifting them, and holding our own hope for ultimate transformation, with the potential for all of these subtle shifts to somehow meet each other in a new equilibrium that might be a little more modest than we think, but is a definite improvement. So I just want to introduce like one other frame that helps me think about like shifting consciousness in this moment. So when I think about what it means to shift consciousness, I think about it in two ways. One is that there's a kind of an ultimate shift in consciousness, which from a spiritual tradition is from kind of person-centered ego narrative consciousness, where your bodily sensations, your emotions, your thoughts basically are your reality. You identify with them. You can't really see a difference between them, and you kind of live out the drama of your personal life. And then this more vast field of awareness that is always there and is the ultimate container within which all of these phenomena arise. And that's kind of an example of like maybe the ultimate shift in consciousness that things like meditation bring you closer towards, or psychedelics can slightly reveal. And I do think that there is a lot of potential for that. A lot of people are going through seriously transformative experiences that could lead to a real, you could say, rupturing of the ego, or a disruption of that narrative. But there's also lots of small wins along the way. So within even a person-centered narrative, there's huge opportunities for shifts in identity, in values, and in behavior. And there's a real opportunity for that to be a shift in consciousness. Even today, the Financial Times, which has been, the mouthpiece for neoliberalism for decades, spoke about how we need to honor unpaid voluntary work, and we need to weave together a new social fabric. You could never imagine the editorial board of the Financial Times saying that until this moment. And so we're also trying to pay attention for all of these small and subtle ways in which we are shifting potentially out of a Homo economicus to a more kind of biopsychosocial self that is more embodied and rooted in place, and that has lots of emotional needs that the society needs to cater for. And then the other frame I'd like to introduce is that it's not clear to me that this crisis will actually be a developmental opportunity. So the way I look at consciousness is that it is the product of many developmental opportunities. And I'm just going to list a few which might be familiar. So some of them are where you're removed from, let's say, your original context or your peer group, i.e. you go to university and all of a sudden you're in a whole new world. Or you face extreme adversity, the old ways of being are no longer working. Or you face an existential reckoning, the death of a loved one. Or you receive a new stimulus, psychedelics and meditation are a good example. Or you have exposure to kind of new norms and social codes. So you're no longer in a toxic masculinity environment. You might be in something that is more vulnerable and more self-aware. So all of these are amazing developmental opportunities. And it's good for us to think about the ways in which coronavirus and the trends with coronavirus are making that more possible. And I can see how confrontation with our mortality, understanding the fragility of our system, and enforced pause, all of them do that. But also, consciousness can regress, and it can regress through what I would call developmental roadblocks. And we're also familiar with times in life when we're kind of, our perspective is narrowed and we're brought into places of self-preservation and fear. So things like financial worries, mental health crisis, too much adversity, where your only fixation is feeding yourself. And even things like authoritarianism and a new regime of control and how that limits, let's say, imagination or liberty or self-actualization. We could also talk about the normalizing of physical distancing in the future. And so there's lots of trends that also could, let's say, work against us. And so they're just some kind of opening thoughts. They're frameworks that help me understand this question. And now what I'd like to do is, before I hand over to Gail, is I'd like to harvest some collective insight from the group. And so if you want to open the chat, I'd like to, so the question is, and you can write like a one sentence answer, but don't press enter when you write it. When you're finished writing, you can just put your thumbs up and don't take too long. And then when everyone has a thumbs up, we're going to hit enter at the same time. So you can actually see a long list of the collective wisdom of the group instantly. And so the question is, when we think about the trends with coronavirus, what are the developmental opportunities that you see? And you can replace developmental opportunities for shifts in consciousness. So I hope that was clear. And you can just type in your sentence, and then when you're done, you can just leave your thumb up, so we can all press enter at the same time. Some thumbs up. So we're just going to take maybe like 20 or 30 more seconds to do that. Yeah, it's obviously very odd to continually keep your thumb up. But how else will we do this? Yeah, you can also have two thumbs up. Yeah. So don't press enter yet. You just leave it there. Okay, so enough thumbs are up. So we'll now all hit enter together and we'll see what we have to say. Okay. That's so cool. There's a lot. So yeah, just let's take a moment just to absorb all of that together. So I'm just going to read some out that jump out at me. Pausing creates space to reflect, stillness. Increased time of personal experience leads to connection with soul, spirit. The voluntary contribution to society is now more important. Yeah, the opportunity to go within and face our fears, our ego, have the space, have the actual space and time to transform community relationships. A healthier relationship with death. Through suffering, minds can change. What it means to slow down and get off the treadmill of this current system to some extent. So that was from Gail. So I think that's a good opportunity, Gail, to bring you in. Do you want to, share what you think?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for holding this space so well, Ronan. I'm really appreciating it. And I do feel quite humbled to be asked such a big question. Yeah, I don't want to rush into just saying a load of stuff. When we were making our prayers earlier, one of them was to not feel like we have to come out with something clever to say. It's just an incredible collective experience right now. To watch my children having that experience is a big deal as well. You know, I think one of the pieces that the school system just doesn't have to be how it is, could be done entirely differently. It's a beautiful thing to see. And I especially paid note to the mother in that channel, said something about mothers being on their knees. And I know it won't just be mothers, parents, but yeah, there's a lot going off. I'm glad that you kind of spoke to the inequality of these times. I know it's been said, but I feel that anything that you say has to stand in that space. And I read an FT article today that was saying that the COVID deaths are probably 60% higher than what's being recorded because of the sort of secondary effects of people maybe not getting to hospital or dying at home and so on. So the current official stat is around 200,000. It's probably 318,000 deaths already. And also I was listening to Bill Gates today, and people may know that Bill Gates had been warning about pandemics, and you're like, he's somebody with quite a lot of credibility and say in the world, talking about what needed to happen on a TED talk some years ago, maybe about 4 years ago. And one of the slides there said that this was going to cost trillions of dollars if we didn't take care of it compared to what it would cost to take care of it. And I just find it really interesting that even in a system that's honed to make money, it wasn't able to make the money that would be made by preparing for a pandemic. It wasn't able to do the cooperation. It just clearly wasn't able to do it. And like those of us that are thinking systemically, that would be clear to us, but it's still mind-blowing that something like a virus that does in principle to some extent have a start and a finish, I mean it depends how it mutates and so on, that our system hasn't been able to take care of that. Bill Gates also said that this is probably the biggest ever failure on our experience our global economies having, and COVID's not a tipping point mechanism as in climate and ecological crises. It's a mechanism that comes and goes. So although I do see COVID as part of the ecological crisis, we know that viruses come because of our relationship with the animal kingdom. And I hope that's part of the consciousness that shifts, that our relationship to how we relate to our animal cousins is going to change. And it's also related to biodiversity loss, so it's not a separate thing. There are other crises on their way, and we just related to that same impoverished relationship. So the antibiotics crisis, myself, my boyfriend and one of my children had to take antibiotics recently for various things, and there's a time to come when they stop working, and that's not something that comes and goes. So I'm sat with that question about what does a shift in consciousness mean, because there's the sort of individual shifts and there's the collective shifts. And I was reflecting the other day about what it was sort of about 10 years ago. It was actually some people in Stroud that started a Bee Guardians project and started talking about the pollinators and our relationship to them. And I had a paddling pool in my garden, some plastic tat, I'm just going to own that, hoping my kids would enjoy it. Some crap I'd bought from B&Q probably. They always deflate, they're rubbish actually, don't buy them. But anyway, and it was full of dead bees, and my friend came, who's a gardener, was just absolutely appalled, and I hadn't even noticed that the bees were flying into this yellow thing. And then within a year, we'd worked on this garden that had very little soil and very little plants in it, and we didn't have this paddling pool anymore doing that, and we'd had made the garden about insects and butterflies, and it was thronging with life. You know, that ability for nature to heal is also, you know, having that experience right now, as many people are talking about the birds singing. And I'm reading Isabella Treese's book at the minute on wilding, on Nep Farm. I don't know how many other people have read that book, on what happens when you allow work with nature, bring species back, actually ruminants, quite a lot of them, grazers, onto British land, and what it does for nature is just incredible in a short space of time. There's shifts obviously around how we're thinking about key workers. You clap for me now. I don't know if people saw that video from people who were in care worker occupations from either Eastern Europe or various racially marginalised people. That racist narrative is really hard to run when you're talking about people holding the fabric of society together. Although Katie Hopkins did, I didn't watch it, come up with a video to try and counter it and say it was racist against white people. So those toxic wounds are coming to the surface. It's watching the crumbling of the old story, isn't it? The story of domination, that man is dominant of nature, and this story of progress, that every year things are getting better. Like, it's really hard to stand by that story. I mean, I've been on you know, radio shows and things like that, and there's usually somebody from The Spectator who comes on to make it sound like environmentalists want to stop progress, and that progress is great and everything's cool and fine, and we can measure progress. There are actually ways of measuring that these folks don't normally speak to. So that story is, it seems to me, it's crumbling, especially the idea that market economies can tend to needs. You know, they can tend to wants and needs that have got economics, that have got money attached to them. And obviously the idea that there's no magic money tree, and I think my friend Sarah said there's a magic money forest now that's been found, this crazy concept of money that suddenly appears from nowhere. It will be positioned as a temporary thing. The Chancellor's already been doing that. And there's talk already of bailing out the fossil fuel industry, never mind airlines, and Virgin, based in the tax haven of the British Virgin Islands. And it's good to hear the pushback. There's been a letter signed, I think in the last few days, by Rowan Williams and others saying it's not okay to bail out companies that are in tax havens. That's why Virgin's called Virgin, it's based in the British Virgin Islands. So I think when I think about consciousness here, I'm thinking about a collective experience. And I think it's right, Ronan, to just be feeling it. You know, what does it feel like? I mean, we're all having our individual experiences within that collective. And I think there's something here about seeing our collective power that needs to shift. when we talk about shifting consciousness, it sometimes feels like it's an individual story, and obviously there is that aspect of all the journeys that we've been on, but where's the sort of collective shift when enough of us see something differently? And I think the collective is so important because we all glitch in and out of reality or unreality, and how we can hold that for each other. Especially when there's so much fear around. You know, I think there's something, you talk to privilege, and I don't know lots of people in this group. It's lovely to see Stu Basden here actually with Dahlia. Stu's another co-founder of Extinction Rebellion, and just to honour their work and the work of other people in this movement, by the way, and to have it sound like it's on my shoulders. Yeah, the fear that's around, and as this virus is taking a hold in what gets called developing countries, more so the exploited world, the majority world, how different that's going to look. You know, the need to stop the debts of those countries, for example. I'm hearing that a famine's on its way. There's various reasons why famine would come, and we know that multi-breadbasket failure is something that can hit this country. Food price hikes. I always smile when I do say things like that. It's a grimace, it's not a grin. So there's this is not finished playing out. So I mentioned that the fossil fuel industry is asking for bailouts, and they're already subsidized, according to I think it was the IMF, to the tune of $10 million per minute, $10 million. Like, and Molly Scott Cato, who's a professor of green economics, said that the problem with thinking about changing the economic system is that it's like it's an aeroplane and you want to change it into a helicopter mid-flight. And there's something now about this sense that the aeroplanes have landed, you know, they're having a pause. I mean, obviously international capitalism hasn't stopped, but the contraction in the economy is going to be, I think, over 30% at least, and that would seem to be indicating a depression to come. I think the definition of a depression or a recession is how long it goes on for. And as Amanda Scott was saying recently, who's the novelist who wrote the Boudica novels and also is a dreamer, that you have these complex systems, and that they get more and more complex, and at some point they get to a stage where they either collapse and cause exterminations, extinctions, or they shift. You know, I think that's I think what she was saying, that's a known piece of complexity theory. I don't know that for a fact. So I don't know where I am on time, Ronan. I just had another thing to say, but I could leave it at that for now, or could say the other thing.
No, please go on. You've got a few more minutes. Okay.
I mean, I this is sort of slightly random comments in a way, but I just wanted to celebrate XR's Alone Together work, in case there's folks here that have been helping that to happen. It's been incredible to watch a decentralized movement, or the extent to which we've managed to decentralize it, come up with support and offerings and so on. That I think what I was trying to say earlier about privilege is there's something on the shoulders of those of us that do have privilege, whether it's economic, whether it's developmental, to really come through in these times, to hold together as a collective. And in that way, I've been working with others on the possibility of a money rebellion. Because as much as, you know, consciousness can shift at an individual level and the stories can shift, to bring about actual systemic shifts does require changing some of the levers that exist in the economic system. As Ha-Joon Chang said, he's an economist from Cambridge, if you want a different economic system, tell me what you want it to do and I'll design one for you. You know, we have all these other choices, and when you've got essentially capitalism begging socialism to bail it out, then there's some room here. The collective was what was beautiful last April when XR was on the streets together, that collective community. And the power line in the collective is something for us to really, really understand in these times, I think. So as bailouts are planned, to actually decide that we're not going to participate in the money system as it exists is something that we could do. And how a money rebellion could work is that it could involve people stopping paying taxes, council tax or tax returns if that's what they do, or certain utility bills, or debts, or taking on new debts and giving the money to somebody else who needs it. There's lots of possible ways of rebelling against an economic system that's designed to kill. I don't know if it's designed to kill life on Earth, but it is killing life on Earth. And like, how would you organise that? We can say that we want a money rebellion, and are people interested? Just simply that question. And if we're interested, and I hope most people would be interested, and obviously all have different circumstances, it's possible for lots of us to phone lots of us up and ask questions like, you know, whether you're a student or whether you rent or whether you've got a mortgage and things like that, and to put groups of people together and say, yeah, there's you know, I don't know, 100 Barclays Bank mortgage holders ready to go, or there's like 1,000 people who pay rent in London ready to go. There's lots of ways we could get collectively organised, and there's some place here of shared risk taking and showing what we're made of. Because the biggest risk is authoritarianism moving into fascism and the scapegoating and deaths. I mean, there was a guy in Texas, some Republican, I think, recently said that there was more to life than living. Sort of funny, except when people like that have a say in what happens next, is quite scary. So I guess I'm hoping that when we think about, to round up, when we think about shifts in consciousness, we think about how those shifts can show up in our collective as a way of saying, we're not doing that anymore. We have to build something else in terms of the systems that created this crisis. It didn't come out of nowhere. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gail. That was really, really helpful to get that distinction between the shifts in consciousness in terms of shifting how we think about systems and maybe the underlying, the story that is shifting, or the shifting in our psyche. So I'd like to invite all of us into a mid-talk stretch. So if you'd like to join me by just bringing your hands up into the air, you can stand up if you want, and then you can just leg stretch all the way across to the side. And while you're stretching across to the side, you can even bring your face in and sideways, so it kind of fits inside the little rectangular box, so that it just becomes this like very odd, loads of people, faces fitting perfectly inside a rectangular box. And then when you're fully sideways, you can just kind of like, yeah, you can just check people out. Because we're kind of living in an upside down world right now. So it's good to kind of see things from all angles. So that's everyone. Yeah, hello. And some people are just continuing stretching. Great. And then we can come back and then we can do the other side. It's tough work, you know, trying to figure all this stuff out. And then I'd like you just to get your hands, just put your hands to the screen, and you can just kind of wiggle them like this. And you can actually show everyone your hands. And obviously, if you've got a thing about your hands, you don't have to show your hands to anyone, but you can just kind of bring your hands up to the screen. Check out my hands. This is what my hands look like. Aren't they great? And you can just see everyone's hands and how different they are. And then I'd invite you to look at your hands like you're really stoned, and maybe you're high on some psychedelic, and you're noticing that you have these strange appendages at the end of your arms. And these hands, you put them to work all day typing away. So you can just kind of like wiggle them around your typing fingers and just appreciate how much work they do for you, typing all of those WhatsApp messages and all of those emails. And then I'd invite you to get your fingers and basically just like tap them on your forehead. So you can just imagine for a moment that your forehead is a keyboard and you are typing yourself a letter. And of course, if you feel like all of this is much too nonsensical for you to engage it, I totally understand. Um, but if you enjoy not taking yourself too seriously, you can just continue to type away. Yeah. And you can just allow all of the ideas that have been shared so far just to kind of make their way into your psyche. You can just kind of like file them away in the little filing cabinets in your mind. And when that's done, you can breathe in with me, and we'll just take a little sigh together. Great. Thank you for going along with that. It's always touch and go as to whether people will join in. Okay, so one of the things that Gail, about you when we met, and then afterwards when I was like reading about like what inspired Extinction Rebellion, was how a lot of the ideas came to you in a deeper space. So I think I read an interview saying that you downloaded the codes for social change in an ayahuasca ceremony, and I know you as someone who is often in a prayer space and is trying to receive wisdom about you know, where Extinction Rebellion should go next, what's the right thing to do. And I want to call that in for everyone, because I think everyone has a version of that. I imagine everyone here has some space in which they commune with something greater than themselves and try and receive wisdom about the meaning of this time for them. And I think in many ways, when we think about shifting consciousness, I spoke before about, one of the triggers is often this adversity, or a way of being or a way of living life just simply not working anymore. And that in mythological terms often sends us into the underworld. We're sent into a world of chaos, where the old us is dying or is no longer there. And we're in this liminal space where there's a new self that's kind of being forged. And it's a really terrifying place. Charlotte Ducan, who's one of the writers of the Dark Mountain Project, said that one of the things about the underworld is that it's easy to get into, but it's very difficult to get out of. You can kind of just be in there for ages. And I've been in like a health crisis now for 18 months, and I really have this feeling that I'm kind of lost in this underworld, and this question of like, will I come out again? And when I think about this particular crisis, it has to be viewed in terms of what is often called the long crisis of the 21st century. That this was maybe the first shared universal crisis that exposed the fragility of our systems, but really it's almost like a starter on a 7-course meal of crises that we'll probably face this century. And I'm curious to know the extent to which this crisis can transform us. And I usually think there's a good correlation between the degree to which we suffer and the amount we change. And the idea that, if you want to predict if someone will change, basically the question is the pain of changing greater than the pain of staying the same? And so I wonder whether will we kind of get off a bit lightly in the coronavirus. It'll be a moment to pause, but ultimately in 6 months' time, we'll kind of be back to normal and the capitalist merry-go-round will be spinning once again. Will we learn some kind of lessons, or will it take a deeper, more sustained crisis, the kind of crisis, Gail, that you and Extinction Rebellion have spoken about, to really take us on this initiatory journey? So I'm wondering if you've any responses to that, both the kind of the deep space of listening, the kind of the journey into the underworld, and the kind of the initiatory experience of these systems crises.
Mm. Wow, thank you. Some big questions there. I was thinking as you were talking about what it's like when somebody you love dies, and you have, I don't know if people have had that experience, and you walk outside and the sky's the same, and you think, how can anything be the same now this person's gone? and you have that deep feeling of beauty and sadness all at the same time, and what that person meant to you, and how could they ever never be here. All those, you know, those big moments, they are very surreal in some ways, and you feel like nothing's going to be the same again after that, and that you're going to remember what matters in life. And then sometime later, my experience is I start behaving like a dickhead again, getting anxious about stuff that don't matter, you know, just back to normal really. And I think it's because, and I think this is part of what I was trying to say, is that we're being held in a culture that's not of our making, you know. So we have to, I think, have to be really careful to not individualize too much the journeys that we're on, because they are a collective journey and a collective culture that's narcissistic and forcing consumerism on us. And I think that's why I was saying about holding each other collectively to try and remind each other of what we know. And I think that is part of what's in what you call the developmental community. The piece around really facing death is what the climate and ecological crisis does for us. I think when you start to think as a parent or as somebody with children in your life that you really love, what's going to be faced in their lifetime, if not in ours, what that means and how initiatory that is, that the, as I say it, the injustice that's happened between Western democracies and our capitalist system and exploited countries comes home as an intergenerational crisis, and that how initiatory that can be when you face it. But then you don't have to face it, you know, you sort of glitch in and out of facing it. It certainly had a big impact on me, that there's dementia in my family, and it became apparent that it was genetic. And in the next few years, I'll find out if I've got the gene. I mean, I could find out tomorrow if I wanted to, if I took a test. It's a choice not to. But it's been an incredible gift, actually, that threat, because I think we're just in such a culture where we don't face our own death. We're actively encouraged not to face our own death and the deaths of those that we love, and it's liberating thinking about death. I find it quite cheery. I mean, obviously I had a bit of a meltdown when that first happened, and I want to be there for my children growing up, but the idea to stop worrying about pensions in the future was really a joy. And I think that we need to be I think this is one of the biggest things, is that we hide death. And maybe coronavirus, you know, is something that's going to stop us being able to do that quite so much. Speaking to some of the other things that you raised, I mean, the better part of myself, these few things happen. One is when I feel kind, and another is when I feel in service to something bigger than myself. And I don't mean to sound, I don't know, either messianic or holy saying that, but there just is a place when you are in that space and it's not about you, that's liberating. I think, in fact, Gandhi said something like, find yourself by losing yourself in service to others. I'm really not trying to pretend I'm like that. The Dick that I mentioned earlier is often in the room, so, you know. And another thing that happened in an ayahuasca ceremony was it had the privilege of being out in this beautiful space and seeing the moon travel the sky. And there's something for me in the reminder that the moon gives me every night, that there's something bigger unfolding here, a bigger mystery that I may never know, I probably won't know, and I probably shouldn't know, you know, to not be wanting to know everything. I think somebody put something like that in the chat channel, you know, there's unfoldings that happen that aren't for us to figure out, but to experience and be with. And the last ceremony that I was in, there was a really big download about joy and celebration of life, that there's something of death that, you know, and grief that also holds that also. I don't think when most people are dying, they want you to be in this misery forever. They, you know, people write these poems, don't they, saying about enjoy your life while you can, you know, live it well. And that, again, it's not about narcissism, it's about really living Yeah, we did play around with ceremonies in Rising Up, which was the group that got Extinction Rebellion off the ground. And what's been a big shift for me in all of that is to sit in sisterhoods once a month with a full moon, and to really, it's pray for sisters to come together and shift their consciousness together. And I made this prayer once that like happened 2 days later, and Skeena came back from a Jen Bendel conference. I was getting really shaken by holding the grief, having written the heading for Extinction Talk, holding the shock of that, really. Even though I'd been an environmentalist for a long time, it's somehow it was shifting in me, and just wanting other women in my community to hold that with me and praying for that to happen. And then Skeena came back from Jen Bendel, went around the whole of Stroud saying, we've got to pay attention to what Gail's doing. It was a big moment. And maybe just to say, because I don't want anything that sounds a bit arrogant, I never got the codes for social change downloaded. I prayed for them, and then Roger told me loads of his theory, and then told me at the end of it was the codes for social change. And I'm not, I often think when I get bits of information, there's bits of the codes, but I do think it was what I needed to know next, and what was needed for a group to work together. So that's how that story works. If you want it said a longer version of it, if you put my name and Breaking Convention, you'll get that story, and the story of working on with a flood dose of iboga. I keep doing this thing when you say things, Ronan, I write various words down, and they're not necessarily a coherent thread, they're just some thoughts back. I hope there's something of value in them.
Yeah, there really is. I would like to open up to all of us now. I think that one of the, I think that the thing that really struck me from what you said was this humility of understanding that we're within a bigger mystery, and it's not for us to understand, but it is for us to experience, and that and parts of that mystery are revealed to us through our experience. And I find what's interesting is that this is the first time in generations where it's a truly universal, shared global experience. You can really get a sense that there is a collective consciousness, that we're all tuned into one moment. The patterns of our experience are quite similar. And so I place a high degree of trust then in people who are sensitive to this moment, that they can presence what's really going on behalf of the collective. I was in a conversation last week with comms people who are trying to think about the new storytelling, the new narratives. And one of the things we landed on was that if we want to know what the future is going to look like, it's probably in the hearts of artists all around the world who are on lockdown and are recording their next album. You know, I think that like the explosion of writing and music and art that is going to come out of this period is going to be absolutely incredible. And that in many ways that will be the feeling of the future, that will give rise to the politics and the economics of the day. And so with that in mind, I wanted us to invite us to do another kind of collective exercise, which is in the chat. And again, it's writing in your answer, but not pressing enter yet. And you can answer this in any way, but what is being revealed to you as you experience this crisis? That's the question. And that could be something very deeply personal to you, or it can be something about the collective. But what is being revealed to you? And when you are finished, you can just like put your finger up or your thumb up, just so I know. And then when everyone is finished, in about 30 or 40 seconds, we can press enter and just see what the flavor is from this now 72 people who are joined. And also like taking your time as well. I know I said 40 seconds, that's a bit ridiculous. Say take your time and do it in 40 seconds. So let's take more time just to really feel what that answer is for us. And if we need to settle to do that, then we can do that. Okay, so when you're finished, you can just put your thumbs up so I can just get a sense of where we are. Great. Okay, I'm seeing, I have to like scroll through all the pages. I'm seeing many thumbs. Right. Okay, so on 3, we can press enter. 1, 2, 3. And we can just allow them all to pour in all of this collective wisdom and insight. And again, just like taking your time just to absorb this. I find it helpful just to scroll from top to bottom because there's often new ones coming in and then you don't get to see the ones at the top. And yeah, because there's so many, it might just be good just to absorb 10, just to get like a cross section rather than trying to get to every one of them. So we're going to try an experiment, and that is if you find one that really resonates with you, I'd invite you to turn your mic on and voice it into the space. And we'll just try and really pay attention to if we can just kind of do it in an order so we're not speaking over each other. It might be a bit clunky, but I just want to see if we can actually turn these words into a voice.
I like this one. Well, this is supposed to be a crisis. Most people are calmer than ever, including people who suffer from anorexia anxiety. Makes me think most of us are living a life out of control.
Thank you.
I like this one from Jade, that nothing is certain, everything is unknown, and we have no control. We need to trust in the process of something greater than ourselves and go with the flow, that we need to come together to support each other in sitting with the shadows and celebrate the light.
Thank you.
From Emily. Cracks that were hidden by the too busy rush had the space they need to be revealed and healed, or opened to reveal what we really need to do, grow now.
To be instrumental to support life and awakening, to accept everything.
From Sally, I'd started to think that I'm connected to something bigger, and now I'm really starting to feel it.
And we'll just take one more.
From Lisa Harvey, the willingness of people, both individually, collectively, to have to confront generational trauma with more presence. Tides are rising together with more discourse rather than shame.
So I'll just invite us after hearing the wisdom of everyone on this group, just to take a minute in silence together, just to listen together. And while we're in this silent space, I'd like to introduce a question of what we feel this moment is calling us to do or to be. So for the remainder of our time, it's a space for anyone to ask any questions they feel are important to ask. And Gail and I can have a go of, giving our thoughts to them or having a dialogue about them. But if you feel like there's been something that hasn't been discussed, or there is an angle that hasn't been considered, it's now our chance to kind of widen what this conversation can be about. Or so it's whatever you feel is important to share. And I'd like you to just pop it in the chat if you have a question, and then I will pick your name out, and then you can voice the question. And if you can mute yourself, if you haven't muted yourself as well, that would be great.
I'll ask a question.
So Martin, if you can just put your question in the chat. I just want to give everyone a space to put the questions down. And I'd also love to hear from more women or female-bodied beings. Just mindful of that. So if you feel like there's a question that's stirring in you, we'd love to hear it. So can we hear from Lisa? Lisa Harvey,
Hi.
your question.
Yeah, sorry, I hadn't finished it and then I pressed enter. But so I'll just read what I wrote and then I'll kind of back it up. So I'm a therapist and I work with people. I work in a women's hospital and I work with individual clients as well. And it's really, really amazing to do the work at the moment because people are like going through huge epiphanies in a way that I've never really seen before, and kind of working through stuff on a personal level in a way that's really inspiring. But I'm just interested in how we take the individual self-realization that comes out of individual consciousness raising or seeing things from a different perspective sort of outwards. So I work very much individually with people, and I know when I'm in the women's hospital, everyone loves to have their sessions individually and they're quite troubled, but when we try and bring it together, it's very troubling and traumatic for people to kind of see similarity. That's a very extreme end of the spectrum. But I guess then with the people I work with privately, they might be enabled to kind of join forces and have a discourse, but there's still a lot of shame, or there aren't spaces, I guess, where people can have those discussions. So I guess that would be one way, because I don't mobilize things, and you know, have a lot more experience with that. And also there's the kind of whole thing of confidentiality, and you know, how do you take something that's a very safe space and encourage people to sort of share things that are actually very communal experiences? Because for me, I guess a lot of the consciousness raising would come from people owning trauma collectively and then mobilizing from that. So yeah, that's my question.
Thanks, Lisa. Gail, any thoughts?
I mean, Lisa, it sounds like that's your expertise, really. So it sounds like great questions. And I'd be more interested to know what you think, really. I mean, and I think in these times, it's a time to sort of look at what we're doing and thinking, well, what more is being asked of me, you know? So is there something that you are or could be doing, like offering like these Zoom calls that are collective things that are sharing, you know, thoughts on that? I don't know, you know, I'd be more interested to hear what you have to say, or somebody else actually.
I think you mentioned women's circles before, and it's not just women, but I think, you know, a lot of that's just recently what I've had. It tends to be, I find it very interesting. It is almost like a universal download that I'll do a week of therapy and the stories are very similar that people are telling. So I don't know if that's not having been to like women's circles in the same way I have ones with close friends, but not with like a bunch of strangers. I guess that might be something that could be done now, like you say, through Zoom, or, but I don't know, be interested to hear other people's thoughts, really.
Is Rich Bartlett on the call? There's just loads of pages here. So Rich, if you're here, can you pipe up? Maybe he's not. This is his Zoom account, by the way, I'm using it. So I will say that there's a really good framework that Rich has developed called micro-solidarity. And it's basically, how do we take the intimacy and the potential for breakthrough that happens in dyad partnerships. So a dyad partnership would be in an intimate relationship where you can go very deep, or in a therapeutic relationship. How do you take that into a crew or a group of, you know, between 4 and 8? And then how do you take that wider into a congregation, and trust that many congregations from different tribes, but going similarly on a developmental journey, surfaces the kind of common patterns of epiphanies in a culture. So that's been a really helpful framework that we work with to try and scale personal transformation beyond the kind of the therapy room. And then the other thing that strikes me is that often lots of people will be privately having an experience. So in this case, all of us are being confronted with parental mortality. Dougal Tyne, another writer in the Dark Mountain Project, wrote a really great piece about this confrontation with parental mortality. And often what happens is that a certain figure will become a symbol for that in our culture in a way that resonates, and then kind of makes that explicit and collectivizes it. So, you know, Boris Johnson was a kind of a lightning rod for the hubris of the strongman being struck down by the coronavirus. You know, Greta Thunberg obviously was a symbol for just the exasperation of the younger generation at boomers not taking action on climate change. And so I also trust that these will surface in symbolic stories that then becomes the kind of the collective understanding. This question from Martin: in crises, do you want to share this, Martin? In crises, conscious people become more conscious.
Yeah, sure. It's a quote by an astrologer called Robert Sibella. And the quote is, in crises, conscious people become more conscious and unconscious people become more unconscious. And there's never been a better time to witness this. So my question is, which group will grow most during this crisis, and which group will have more influence on our future?
Wow, big one. Gail, any thoughts?
I mean, it's a really interesting quote. I suppose the first thing I have is a feeling of like not wanting to feel separated from people that have conscious, you know, that makes, I'm not saying it's wrong, but it's just my first reaction to that quote is that feeling of separation from, you know, like my boys go to an ordinary comprehensive school, so I'm in chat channels with parents and sports teams and things like that, and how they're feeling and coping with things. Quite a bit of humour actually is cool, and I think humour is a great way of dealing with fear, isn't it? And I suppose, I guess what comes up for me is like, if some of us have consciousness, what can we do to reach out and tell new stories in a way that's, maybe it's Trojan horse like smuggling things in, and maybe humor is part of it, you know, that we can share. I mean, I think that's the purpose of humor. And like I appreciated what Ronan was saying earlier about artists, because I just feel like I'm a nerd, and I don't mean to have a downer on nerds. I like being a nerd, but you know, to me, the artists are a huge part of this. And I mean, storytellers, communicators, comedians, visual artists. So I don't think we're in that's not how I understand consciousness, to be this like polarized thing. I think different people hold different, if we're a collective body, if I'm a body in the collective of the world and I have the good grace to have this particular experience, I don't want to feel that I don't think I'm really answering your question, Martin. I just want to feel that I'm different to like my cousins, my aunties, my, you know, fellow parents. Like, there are things that I'm seeing that they might not be, but what about vice versa, you know? So I just want that togetherness. To me, that is part of the shift in consciousness, is not feeling separate. So thank you.
Thanks, Gail. Yeah, I think I've been thinking about this question a lot, and in a way, it's a classic question about how we respond to many crises. Is there this kind of turning inward, looking after self, looking after your immediate tribe? Is there a closing of borders? Is there a surrendering of control to a strong man leader? Or is there a kind of a willingness to shift, to unravel, to move into new forms of being and organizing, new forms of complexity? And I think that's one of the stories of the 21st century, is that all of these crises are ultimately an invitation into that phase shift of the system and the corresponding culture. But because of, you know, our entrenched psychologies and vested interests, that the former response of kind of regressing and retreating is quite strong. And I feel that, you know, if you think about like how a system will evolve, it's basically, you know, it's in an equilibrium, and then it experiences certain crises and it goes out of equilibrium, and it can basically go into many other different types of systems, which are like attractor states. So at the moment, you could say we're in a kind of a neoliberal, at least in the West, kind of social democratic model. But easily, there is quite a strong attractor state from kind of an authoritarian fascism or a Chinese model of government that's growing very strong. Yeah, at times I can find it very compelling that this is the strongest attractor point in the system. And that it's only when we choose that, and then that fails catastrophically, that there will be a genuine opening to something new. And in the meantime, it is probably more like there will be kind of centers of renaissance. So you see Amsterdam experimenting with donut economics. You can see Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, like demonstrating an incredible form of leadership, UBI in Spain. So I feel like, and again, with any system in crisis, there will always be adaptive niches that kind of have the new source code or the new DNA while the old system fails. And so I think that the kind of the framing of conscious and unconscious creates this unhelpful hierarchy when it's really more about landscapes. So some landscapes are very fertile for development, and some landscapes are very fertile for regression. And so you often find, for example, like smaller countries just inherently have better collective solidarity. They have a better landscape because they're smaller and there's more identification in larger countries. So it's often good to think about this in terms of like regions in the world which have a developmental potential or a conscious potential. So we've got about 9 minutes left. Just and Gail, feel free to kind of come in or riff on that or disagree or whatever.
Thanks. Yeah, there's so many questions. I sort of I'm loving how you're holding this, and I'm also wishing we might have started questions sooner, but never mind. And I can't really track them all. But I guess I'm spotting. Well, I wanted to say there was a big article in the Sunday Times exposing the government's failings, and for that to come from the Times felt like a big deal. You know, to expect that in the Guardian. And I just wonder how easy it is going to be for authoritarianism to tell a story that, you know, go with us when it's the sort of, it's some of the women leaders that aren't running the authoritarian story that have helped us to cope with this crisis, like the last in New Zealand. I'm sorry I can't dig the name out right now. I'm not going to try and get buried in those questions, but I'm feeling one of the participants really asking about hope and despair, and you know, whether it's going to be all right or not. And I guess that's what I was trying to say about the moon. It's a little bit of a vague hippie thing to say in some ways, but Alan Watts wrote a book called The Wisdom of Insecurity. And I think it's that part of ourselves that wants to know that things are going to be okay, that is like a hungry ghost that's never going to be fed. And like what I'm going to say around children and hold out for young ones in my life is I'm absolutely going to do everything in my power to make sure that they've got a great future. And that's where we should be pointing our service towards. But I don't think that joy and hope and despair come from what's going to happen to us. They come in the moment, to do with like how present we are to love and to what we're grateful for. And I know these are kind of fairly corny things to say, but I really think that's the place, if you're in that need for reassurance, like first of all, do stuff that's in service to life. Like it will give you something to do that's useful, and in my experience anyway, like let go of that kind of, you know, what Joanna Macy calls active hope then. And to be in celebration, even you know, of the things that we do get to be grateful for. There's so much could shift, of course, you know, this may be the great transformation. I mean, I think we can just say that, maybe the great moment, we may already be in it. It may be that everything dies and we all, and consciousness on a universal level learns something and it reprograms and something else comes from. Who knows, you know? like, and life does include suffering, and that's easy to say when you're a white person sat in a warm house with food in the fridge and stuff. But yeah, a gratitude practice is always helpful, isn't it? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm reminded of the quote from Martin Luther King: even if the world was going to pieces, I'd still plant my apple tree. And yeah, this idea that this hope or despair question, if it's based on like facts in the world, as opposed to just a disposition, that regardless of how it is or how likely it is, I'm going to show up fully and bring beauty to my surrounding or to the world. And that in itself, that is the energy of hope. It's a kind of a self-perpetuating thing. And I also hold like this question from Manon in some changing the reality as much as in others. In some countries, it is just another disaster on top of another. For example, in Sierra Leone, it reminds people of the Ebola crisis that lasted for years. In East Africa, food security is always is threatened by a locust plague. What good will this bring to countries where people are used to being in survival mode? You know, so I'm also holding, like Gail said, this is a kind of a luxurious question to ask if you've got those basic needs met and you're in a country with the infrastructure on some level at least to handle the crisis. And so, you know, I ultimately, I think that no one knows whether this will be for better or for worse, or will lead to a regression or an expansion of consciousness. I imagine that not looking at the world in a uniform way or projecting our worldview or our part of the world onto the rest of the world is probably the way forward. Some people will, you know, it'll be a disaster, and for others, it'll be a huge learning moment. Yeah, but thank you for that question. So we've got 3 minutes left. I wonder, Gail, if you just have any closing thoughts or reflections given what you've heard. And also, we started before everyone came on the call with a prayer. And I wonder if you could maybe lead us out with a prayer, if that feels good or comfortable.
Maybe not good and comfortable, but you know, it's all about working with the discomfort. I guess I'm just, you know, I'm seeing Tamsin asking about Donella Meadows transcending the paradigm leverage point, and I can't remember I'm feeling like I wish we were having another hour in a group conversation, really. I know that folks are bringing in concerns around 5G, and I feel like they don't get voiced, and we could leave space for that to be said, you know. So I'm just kind of looking through here just to at least acknowledge what we haven't talked about.
Sure.
Yeah, just wanting to kind of yeah, say what a rich group of folks, you know, and yeah, like we all do. Let's just keep having these conversations. Thank you. I don't have more to add, but I'm happy to try and pray in some way. Yeah. I actually, if we do a prayer, maybe we'd stop the recording, you know. A friend of mine did a prayer recently, and I was really glad to see it, but I also, when with a liminal space thing, it's kind of a bit funny to catch it, isn't it? Do you see what I mean?